So that's what you can do to investigate past conduct, but you're also going to have to investigate what happened here. And there are some basic things that need to be investigated or requested. For example, more and more things are on videotape. A lot of patrol cars have dash cams that continue to run while the officer walks up to the car. And so you need to get a hold of that because it might contradict what's in the police report, or it might show stuff that's in the that is not in the police report, or it might give a context for what's in the police report that kind of diminishes the impact of what the officer has written, shows that there's an offense that otherwise the lawyer might not have known about except talking to you, but it corroborates you. So anytime there's a video, you need to try to find it. A lot of officers have belt recordings. They don't necessarily say that their belt recording was going, but I've had cases that turned on getting a copy of the belt recording. This wasn't a crime against police officers case, but there was an officer that interviewed my witness, and he forgot to turn off the belt recording, and then he went and continued to interview the victim. And what the victim said at that point was much different than showed up in the police report, and was very helpful in getting the case laughed out of court at the preliminary hearing. So belt recordings need to be requested. There is an agency, a local agency, who has done the very wise thing about putting tiny little cameras and audio recording devices on all their officers, and all of their contact with suspects need to be recorded. That's a requirement of the department. Interestingly enough, I have heard that the number of arrests for crimes against peace officers has gone down about 50% since the initiation of that program. Okay, so recordings, video, belt tapes, anything like that might be out there you need to look at. There's 911 calls, or there are dispatch calls from the officer to dispatch, and sometimes there's an entry by the officer on their mobile data transmitter, something they can just put directly into the system that's recorded contemporaneously with the event as they type it in, or at least right after the event. Mobile data transmitter. It'll be on the computer-aided dispatch record. It's called a CAD. You need to get a hold of that. Sometimes it's routinely given, sometimes it's not, and sometimes what's put contemporaneously into the record on these CADs is different than what shows up in the police report. So that's really important too. Investigation. Really nice to be able to send an investigator out to see if there's some third party who saw this event and has a different version from the officer. And that happens sometimes. Sometimes they're good witnesses, sometimes they're not, but you need to find them. It's a good thing not to advertise you're doing that. I needed to get a continuance once to send an investigator out because the folks I was working for didn't get the investigator out real quickly. So I told the court I needed this continuance to send an investigator out to talk to this one person that lived in this one trailer in front of this yard, and who I heard had a different version than the official version. Surprisingly, that person packed up and moved real suddenly between the time that I got the continuance and the officer was sitting in the courtroom listening, and the time that my investigator got out there to interview them. We found a witness on another case that the officer didn't have a particularly good reason for doing what he did to my client. When we disclose that witness, as we're required to, we would go back and we were told that The person wasn't alive anymore. I don't think that the officer killed him. That would be craziness. And I'm not crazy enough to think that an officer's going to do that. But I'm not sure that it was true that she was gone the way we were told. A relatively young woman. Finding a witness isn't necessarily a magic bullet, but if you find a witness that recorded something, that's golden. And that needs to be pursued, the possibility that there were other witnesses. Sometimes there are other, you have to sort of understand, it's helpful to learn the technology of police equipment. There are all kinds of new technology. Tasers, these things that you fire them off and they stun you and they hurt like hell, but supposedly they don't have much of a bad effect. Now, if you get tased by 60 times and it happens, you can see how many times a person is tased if it's skin on or taser on skin contact, because you might count 120 little burn marks. People have been killed by that. Body's not designed to take that kind of punishment. It can affect the heart, have in cases. But anyway, that's one of the reasons for that is because it's especially in years past, it was kind of a new tool, and some officers were treating it kind of like a new toy and didn't know how to use it with restraint and were tasering people without a particularly good reason, like the woman who got pulled over, the pregnant woman who got pulled over in Texas for a seatbelt ticket, and she didn't want to sign the ticket, so the officer tasered her. Not a particularly appropriate thing to do to a pregnant woman just because you don't want to sign a ticket, but there you go. But that's the kind of thing that sometimes happens. The thing about these tasers is that very few officers are going to say they went crazy with a taser and tasered your client a dozen times. So photographic evidence is really good to show that all these taser marks on your client's skin. And the other thing is that tasers have a little microchip in them. And they record every time the taser is discharged. So if you can get that microchip, and it shows that the taser was discharged a dozen times, according to the record at the time your client was arrested, it's real good evidence. It's not perfect evidence. The officer's going to say, well, I tested it 3 times before I blasted your client. And there have been times where these memory chips sometimes only hold so many, like 1,000 things. So we actually had a case where an officer fired the thing about 1,000 times to erase the memory of this event. That itself is pretty good evidence that maybe something was amiss. And there are other ways they can get around it, but it should be asked for and pursued and examined. I'll finish with a little story. We had a client who was on a date night with his wife with another couple. They got turned around away at a comedy club. The young man might have been a little bit more boisterous than he needed to, so someone called the guards called the police. Police escorted him off the premises of this mall where the comedy club was. He was kind of frustrated, so he let go of his girlfriend's hand, turned around and flipped off the officers. Now, it's not polite. I wouldn't recommend it. But it is still First Amendment activity. The consequence of which was that he was kicked, beaten, and tasered pretty thoroughly, and then arrested. Now, it would have had a bad ending, but this happened at a pretty upscale mall, and the mall had a videographer that was covering the grounds just in case things like this happened. So the entire event was on video. Jury saw the video. and acquitted my client of most of the charges. One, they hung 11-1 for not guilty. Charges were dismissed. Good ending. Now, I have heard that after that event, some of the other local lawyers have tried to subpoena that video the way that we did. And for some reason, the mall is no longer recording such events. They seem to be preoccupied elsewhere, and the cameras don't go to where the officers are detaining somebody. And the next video is going to be on the subject of trial.